Welcome. Star USA is a consulting, advice, training, and services firm in the field of international trade and compliance. We are based out of Northeast Ohio for the last 25 years, and we provide an array of services to importers, exporters, brokers, carriers, and forwarders of many different sizes and skill levels. My name's Joe Harper. I'm a principal with Star USA. I have my customs broker's license. I have been in the international trade compliance business for over a decade. During that time, worked with a lot of clients, gone to a bunch of facilities, dealt with a lot of topics. We hope you learned something from today's session. We look forward to your questions and feedback. And as Michael said, throw in your toughest, trickiest ones for the end to try to catch me off my game. Today's topic is ECCN and licensing. So I want to let you know right off the bat, the goal today is to give you a very high level of ECCNs and licensing. You will not be a pro, but you should know more about what you don't know and start to be familiar with some of the concepts that are out there. This is also going to assume that you have some familiarity with exporting. If you don't have any awareness of exporting, you will probably be pausing a lot to go look up some concepts, and you may want to take a look at some of our other export trainings on YouTube. Just out of the gate, most export regulations fall under the following U.S. departments and agencies. We have Department of Homeland Security, which is where CBP is housed. And CBP is the party who tends to be on the front lines of making sure all of the data is communicated correctly, even for exports. Then we have Department of Commerce, which houses Census and BIS. BIS is governed by the Export Administration Regulations, or the EAR. And you will hear terms like dual use items, which we'll talk about a lot more later on in this session. And they use the Commerce Control List that has all of their goods. Census is really about the statistics. So they are the party who's collecting the export information, and their role there is to really just help you communicate what you need to communicate to the government agencies involved. Then there's Department of State, which houses the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls. The DDTC operates by the Arms Export Control Act, as well as the International Traffic in Arms Regulations. Those are AECA and ITAR. The goods under their purview are defense articles, and they're found on the United States munitions list. Then there's Department of Treasury, which houses OFAC. And OFAC, their authority comes from executive orders as well as foreign asset control regulations, and they tend to be involved with sanctions and the like. So from the beginning, if you don't know which agency or jurisdiction your goods are subject to, you would apply for a commodity jurisdiction ruling with the DDTC. There is a resources page at the end of the slides. There's a link to the form to submit and some more information about that. This webinar assumes that your goods are under the EAR, which means they are under Department of Commerce, subject to BIS regulations, and they are not ITAR. They are not defense or USML goods. An export is a shipment or transmission of an item out of the US. That could be a product, could be software, could be technology. It could just be information. And the item doesn't have to leave the United States in order for it to be exported. You could just have a citizen of another country walk through your facility, read or consume that technology, and there is a deemed export. Exports are controlled under the Export Administration Regulations. They are on the Commerce Control List, or the CCL. They are broken into ECCNs, where items are identified by specific characteristics. So the CCL is based on the Wassenaar arrangement. There are a whole bunch of countries that have utilized it, and it breaks goods into categories of dual use items. There's 11 of them. So there's nuclear, materials, chemicals, microorganisms and toxins, computers, sensors and lasers, aerospace and propulsion. And then each of those categories have 5 product groups. So group A is systems, equipments, and components. B is test, inspection, and production equipment. C is material. D is software. E is technology. The category plus the product group plus then the 3-digit designation results in your ECCN. If goods are not specifically identified on the Commerce Control List, but they're still subject to the Export Administration regulations, then they are deemed to be EAR 99. And everything is subject to the EAR for the most part. EAR 99 items generally consist of low-tech consumer goods and often don't require a license. This Commerce Control List is found in Part 774 of the Export Administration Regulations, which is also in 15 CFR. So these are examples of what an ECCN would look like. A MIG welder could be classified under Category 2, materials processing, Group B, production equipment. And then the last 3 digits are 999. And then there is a letter maybe, or a letter and then a number provided after that specifies the specific description underneath that heading of 1C008 or 7D003. Things that are not subject to the EAR are items that are under the jurisdiction of other agencies. So either they're under ITAR or OFAC or the like. Free speech or publicly available items. Those things are not subject. You can get an ECCN multiple places. So you can ask the manufacturer or the producer. They may not be aware of export regulations. They may not be based in the US, or there could be other constraints or reasons that they couldn't provide it. If they do provide it, when you get that ECCN, take a look at it, make sure it makes sense, put it in your records. You should have, if they give it to you over the phone, you should write down in the product information, spoke to this person on this date and they said it was this ECCN. If it's by email, make sure that that email is cross-referenced in your product records. That's a big deal because if you use that and BIS asks questions, you have the backup that you did your due diligence and it made sense to you. Confirm the reasons for control. So once you have that ECCN, you want to cross-reference it with the Commerce Control List and the country chart, see why it's controlled. We'll dig into that more in a minute, and see if a license is required. You can also self-classify. If you're going to do that, you need to have all of the product information so that you can check for all parameters. BIS has an order of review classification tool on their website. It is also in supplement number 4 to part 774 of the EAR. And what you do is you know the characteristics of the product and you pick a category. So you pick one of those 11 categories that you were provided, and then figure out which of the 5 product groups it falls into. Then you want to rule out some specific items. You want to rule out the 600 series, and that means ECCNs where the last 3 digits are in the 600s. Those items tend to be more complex. They're often for military use and were once subject to ITAR and were on the USML, the United States munitions list, but we have decremented them a little bit. So now they're on the CCL subject to the EAR, and they're in the 600s. You also want to check and either confirm or rule out those ECCNs that start with 9 and end with 515. So 9A 515, 9E 515, etc. Those cover spacecraft, things like radiation hardened microelectronic circuits that used to be on the USML but are no longer, etc. And then you also want to rule out specially designed, and you will know whether a heading is specially designed or not because it says the words in the heading wording specially designed. We're going to talk about that in depth on the next slide, so don't worry about that. Then you want to look at the other ECCNs in your product group that you picked to see if it's described. If it's described under a specially designed heading, you classify it that way. If it's not described under any ECCN of any category on the Commerce Control List, then it's EAR 99. And you should document your rationale, document how you eliminated ECCNs, the product characteristics, etc. Then confirm the reasons for control and check if a license is required. You can also ask BIS to classify it for you, and you do that via the website SnapR. They call it a CCATS. That's the tracking system for your commodity classification request. There are details in 15 CFR 748.3. The BIS website, which this is a link, so once you have the slides, you can click on these to reach them, has so much good information about how to submit a classification request. And they have certain timeframes that they need to meet, usually around 30 to 45 days to get your response back. BIS can only classify items that are subject to the EAR, so you cannot send them something on the USML and ask them to classify it. And then keep your records. Any related items that you get a classification request for or that you use should reference that CCATS number. Specially designed. So this is a concept that is specifically stated in a heading, and I'll show you an example of that on the, actually, I'm just going to show you real fast on the next slide. So it says software specially designed. So if it says specially designed, then you are in a specially designed heading. And it's caught by that if it is a result of development and it has properties that are peculiarly responsible for achieving or exceeding the performance levels, characteristics, or functions in the relevant ECCN or USML paragraph, or it's a part, component, accessory, attachment, or software for use in or with a commodity or defense article enumerated or otherwise described on the CCL or USML. So if you are caught by definitions 1 or 2, you are in scope of an ECCN that has specially designed in the description. You can be released to another ECCN or to EAR 99 by these items in the release category. This is a paraphrase. The catch is direct quote. These are paraphrases, but in general, B1 releases based on a commodity jurisdiction that was done by DDTC, or a CCATS done by BIS, or the fact that specially designed doesn't apply to that ECCN. B2 releases if it's a fastener. So even if it's specially designed, if it's just a generic item like a screw or a bolt, it can be released. B3 releases an item from specially designed if it is essentially the same as another item that is EAR 99 or is under an ECCN that is only controlled for anti-terrorism reasons. B4 through B6 are for goods that are not in production or are in development, and it gives exclusions for whether they're not for use with controlled items. So if you can use those things with items that are not strongly controlled or are not specially designed or are controlled for reasons other than anti-terrorism, then it can be released from the specially designed heading. There are notes to the specially designed applications that give you interpretive guidance. Most of the time, people are caught by A2. It's a part, component, accessory, attachment, or software for use with an item that's enumerated on the CCL or USML. For example, in CNC machines, that's the software that controls the CNC. Or if you make a part for an aircraft and one of the aircraft that it goes in is specifically named and is specially designed and is on the USML, but the other aircraft it can go in are not specifically named or are only controlled for anti-terrorism reasons, then it can be released from the specially designed heading. Specially designed is kind of a booger of a concept, and it's complicated for a lot of people. So if you are one of those people, don't worry about it. Just check and see if your item falls under specially designed over here. And if it does, check and see if your item can be accepted from that by one of these options. This is the basic format of an ECCN on the Commerce Control List. So you start out with the 5-digit alphanumeric code. Then you have the language of the heading. And your item needs to fit in the language of the heading before you proceed on down to the list of items controlled. If a word is in quotes, that means there is a definition for it in the EAR. And you can go to the list of definitions and find what that means to BIS the way that they are using it. So for this one, software, specially designed, development, production, and use all have definitions that tell you how to interpret this heading. So 2D983 is software that is specially designed or modified for the development, production, or use of equipment controlled by 2A983. If it is also for equipment that is not controlled by 2A983, then you could get it released from this specially designed heading. Then it tells you whether or not a license is required and says the reasons for control. So we have RS and AT. Those are regional stability and anti-terrorism. And it tells you whether it applies to the entire entry or just specific items that were controlled. And it also tells you which column on the country chart. So just put a pin in that, we'll come back to it. Then it tells you which list-based license exceptions your item may or may not be subject to. And it kicks you over to part 740 of the EAR for a description of all the license exceptions. So it says TSR and it's not applicable for this one. Then it lists out the items controlled, whether or not they're related controls, whether or not they're related definitions, and then says what the items are. For this ECCN, it's a really simple one. It says that the list of items controlled is contained in the ECCN heading. That one's very nice. There may or may not be technical notes or control notes. These provide definitions and guidance similar to what the explanatory notes do for the HTS, but they're directly in line. Note that these are for 2B206C. There's a control note It says it does not control measuring interferometer systems without closed or open loop feedback containing a laser to measure slide movement errors of machine tools, dimensional inspection machines, or similar equipment. So it's saying if your item otherwise fit in 2B206C but meets one of these, it's kicked out of 2B206C. Then there are technical notes that provide the definitions. Things like linear displacement means the change of distance between the measuring probe and the measured object. You always want to read through the entire ECCN as well as read down through the rest of the category. So if you looked at 2B001 for your item and it doesn't fit there, you would go on down to 2B201, which is similar items slightly less controlled. And if it doesn't meet the 2B201 requirements, you would go on to 2B991, which are similar, less technical items and are less controlled. So the ECCN tells you what the items are, why they're controlled, and it also walks through the destination and list-based exceptions for it. These are the reasons for control that are identified in Part 738 of the Export Administration Regulations. You have anti-terrorism, chemical and biological weapons, crime control, chemical weapons, encryption items, firearms convention, missile technology, national security, nuclear proliferation, regional stability, short supply, UN embargo, significant items, and surreptitious listing. Here's some sample ECCNs. So the Commerce Control List, again, is Part 774 of the Export Administration Regulations, which you can find in 15 CFR if you're looking online. These are the headings. So you always want to check the headings, make sure that these definitions make sense to you and whether or not your item is in there, and then you can read on through. You have, again, those list of items controlled after this, as well as maybe related controls or related definitions. Those may have reporting requirements and license exceptions, as well as notes. But we're going to come back to 3A101 and 2B351. Of these, 3A101 is an electronic equipment, device, part, or component other than those controlled by 3A001. So this shows you that progression that I was talking about on the last slide, where if it doesn't fit in 3A001, you move on to 3A101. And it's controlled for missile technology and anti-terrorism, both of those column 1. 2B351 is a toxic gas monitor and monitoring system, and they're dedicated detecting parts and components, things like detectors, sensor devices, and replaceable sensor cartridges as follows. So that means they have to be in the list of items controlled, except for systems and detectors controlled by ECCN 1A004C. So you would want to go look at 1A004C to make sure it doesn't fit there. And those are controlled for chemical and biological, column 2, and anti-terrorism chemical, column 1. There we go. So dual use items. The EAR provides for dual use items. That's what BIS tends to have jurisdiction over. We have control for these as safeguards on the sale of items or info that can be used in the manufacture or creation of controlled items or technologies. So goods can be both commercially available and for use in a restricted manner, whether or not that's their intended use. So an IED consists of a trigger system, an initiator, and an explosive. The trigger system could be made from a relay, the type that's commonly used in office equipment and consumer electronics. It can also be used to remotely detonate an IED. The initiator, we have spark gaps. Those are used in the medical field. They're part of lithotripter machines those help break up kidney stones. They are also used to trigger nuclear devices. So items can be for public, commercial, benign use, and they can also be used to do harm. And those are dual use items, and they are controlled because we want to make sure they don't end up in the hands of bad actors, as BIS refers to it. So that is the first part on ECCNs. Then part 2 covers license determination. So figuring out, do I need a license, and also how do I apply for it? When you're walking in and you know your item is controlled, you need to know if you need a license. Does BIS require it? So you have to know your product and the ECCN, where it's going, who it's going to, not just the country, but the actual person and company, and how they're going to use it. Most commercial exports don't need a license, but you need to know, is the destination sanctioned? Is the end user sanctioned? Are they a denied party? Is it a prohibited party? And is that end use specific to higher controls? So if you want to know about this, Supplement 1 to Part 732 talks you how to figure out if you need a license. So if your item is subject to the EAR, yes, go ahead. If not, get out of the EAR. What are you doing here? Go talk to ITAR. Is it classified under an ECCN on the CCL? If yes, you can proceed. If no, it's EAR 99. Do the prohibitions 4 through 10 apply? And it tells you where. They're in 736.2. If not, then it's going to be no license required. If yes, then you need to submit an application for a license. If your article has an ECCN, do the prohibitions apply? If not, is there an X in the box on the country chart? We'll take a look at that. Is a license exception available? If there is, use a license exception. And if there is not, then you apply for a license. So the first hurdle is the country of destination. So you use the country chart, which is in 15 CFR 738, to figure this out. Our example ECCNs had missile tech column 1, anti-terrorism column 1 for the first one, and then the second one was chemical and biological weapons column 2 and anti-terrorism column 1. So for the first one, an analog to digital converter that can be used in missiles that meets the requirement of 3A 101, you can see that a license is required to all of these countries because there's an X in the box. And it's required because of missile tech reasons. It is not required for anti-terrorism reasons. So when you went to apply for your license, you would say it's because of MT reasons. For item 2, the toxic gas monitor controlled by 2B351, a license is required for any of these countries that have an X in CB2. AT1 doesn't impact it at all. For example, Netherlands, you would not need a license for the toxic gas monitor, but you would for Nicaragua, Pakistan, Panama, Peru, etc. If there is an X in the box of the column you have noted in the ECCN heading, you need a license or you need a license exception. If there is no X on the row with your country, then you do not need a license. But you should also document that you don't need a license as you're going through. EAR 99 does not have any reasons for control. I'm going to launch a poll. Are all EAR 99 items not licensed? So you guys can answer a poll. The question is, if an item is designated EAR 99, does that mean a license is never required? All right. So most of you say no, sometimes a license is required. There are some of you who say, yep, if it's EAR 99, a license is never required. 15 CFR 774 supplement 4 says EAR 99 items may require a license if destined for a prohibited or restricted end user, end use, or destination. So even if your good is EAR 99, you may still need a license if it is going to a prohibited or restricted end user, and that could be a person or a company. End use, so if the thing they want to use it for is prohibited or restricted, or destination, so if that country is prohibited or restricted. That's one that BIS loves to get you on in their trainings, is whether or not EAR 99 requires a license. There are different kinds of licenses or conclusions you can reach about a license. So you could get an individual validated license or a blanket license. That's a license that you apply for using SNAP-R. You submit a lot of information about you, your customer, your relationship with the customer, the product, and the end use. And you have to swear to good purposes. It takes a few weeks to a few months for BIS to process through and return it. And it is limited to specific items and values. Then there are license exceptions. They could be list-based. So those are the ones that are spelled out underneath the ECCN and say either yes or no next to them. And there are transaction-based. Those are granted depending on the facts that surround the transaction. Or no license required, in which you would state NLR. That's when there's no X in the box on the country chart. They're EAR 99 going to a non-embargoed country and a non-denied end user for a non-restricted end use. So it could be either of those things. This is a BIS chart on determining license requirements under the EAR. Same thing we saw before, just more colors. So license exceptions are authorizations that allow you to export, re-export, or transfer in-country items that are subject to the regulations that would otherwise require a specific license. They have to meet conditions. Most cases, you can just certify that they meet the conditions and you don't have to get anything from BIS or send anything to them. In most conditions, they are all found under Part 740 of the Export Administration Regulations. They are a 3-letter symbol, and you have to use that 3-letter symbol for clearance purposes. So you're going to report it on the EEI AES filing or on the airway bill. They are country specific. They can be limited that way. Supplement 1 to Part 740 of the EAR lists out the country groups. Country group A are regime members. Country group B are those that are less restricted. Country group D are countries of concern, and E are terrorist supporting countries. The license exceptions are, again, in Part 740. The first one is LVS, or limited value shipments. The ECCN will outline the limits. So it could say LVS, yes, 5,000 or LVS 3,000. These are for country group B only. Single orders cannot be split shipments. and you can do they have annual limits for them. Then there are Group B shipments. Those need to be items that are restricted for national security only, and there are reporting requirements for some of them. So that's an exception to not needing to tell BIS anything. Then TSR, which is technology or software restricted. They need to be going to a country in Group B. They need to be controlled only for national security, and you have to have prior written assurance. So those three are list-based license exceptions. You will actually see them on the CCL. They are tied to the item and the ECCN. The ones that are coming up are transaction-based. Most of them are not on the CCL unless they're put there as a you cannot use this license exception heads up. So these ones are easy to forget about, and you want to remember them because it's helpful. TMP are temporary imports, exports, and re-exports. These are things like tools of the trade, kits of replacement parts, demo or exhibit items, items that are being inspected or repaired abroad. And all of these need to be returned, consumed, or destroyed within 1 year of export. RPL is for service and replacement of parts and equipment. It's a 1-for-1 for immediate repair of defective or unacceptable parts and equipment. They can only be replacement parts for items that were legally exported. You cannot repair or replace things that were illegally exported. You cannot do any improvements to design, capability, or performance. And the replacement items need to be returned or destroyed promptly, the things that they replaced. ENC covers encryption items. Those are exports, re-exports, or transfers of encryption items classified under 5A002, 5B002, 5D002, or 5E002. And they may require prior BIS review. BAG is for baggage. And then there's a new one, ACE, authorized cybersecurity exports. That was added in October of 2021. It provides for specific ECCNs in categories 4 and 5. Those are things like computers, telecommunications equipment. And they authorize exports to government end users if they meet specific requirements. So you'll notice I didn't talk about them all. That's because we would be here a very long time. But you can see a sampling of what the exceptions are for and the requirements you'd need to meet. You need to verify when you're getting ready to export who it's going to, whether or not there are proliferation activities, and you should do list-based screening. So you should always do a restricted party or sanction screening against all of the lists. There is a screening tool, the Consolidated Screening List, or CSL, that's put on that has all of the entity lists. It's very helpful. You should look for red flags. BIS has great handouts on red flags, things like abnormal or suspicious activities. If you notice any of them, ask questions and reevaluate. Check and see if there are general restrictions that would prohibit the use of a license exception. And then embargoed or sanctioned country screening. You are looking out for Iran, Cuba, Syria, Sudan, North Korea, and now Russia and Belarus. Check if a license is required. If it is there an exception available? If there is an exception, is it subject to any general restrictions that would prohibit the use of that? The 10 general prohibitions are in part 736 of the EAR. They are, you prohibit export and re-export of controlled items to specific countries, prohibit re-export and export from abroad of foreign-made items with more than de minimis controlled US content, foreign produced direct product of technology and software, if there are denial orders, if export or re-export is to prohibited in users or for prohibited in uses, then you cannot do it. You cannot send anything to embargoed destinations for proliferation activities. Items cannot be unloaded in transit. No order, terms, or conditions can be violated, and do not proceed with knowledge of a violation. So don't worry about looking at all the exceptions if you don't need a license. But if you are looking at the license exceptions, do check all the restrictions and look at all of the criteria. Some don't apply to certain ECCNs or for some reasons for control, prohibited end users, or specific end uses. You cannot use a license exception if authorization for that is suspended or revoked. If the export is subject to a general prohibition, a surreptitious interception device, can't use it for crime control items to most destinations, most missile technology, and almost all embargoed destinations. So let's take a look at an example. You are shipping some fluorinated silicone lubricant. There's a kinematic viscosity under 5,000 centistokes at 298 K, and your shipment value is 2,500 going to Brazil. So you know, since it's 2,500, you're going to need to file an EI. It's classified as 1C006, that is the ECCN, and it's provided for in B2. It is controlled for national security, column 2, and anti-terrorism, column 1. It says you can do group B shipments for 1C006D. This is in 1C006B, so you cannot do group B shipments, but there is a low value shipment of $3,000. We're sending it to Brazil. National security has an X in the box, anti-terrorism does not. So it needs a license. It's going to Brazil, but LVS was an option on the ECCN. So you want to pull up the information on the LVS license exception. It says it is for all destinations in country group B, as long as the net value of the commodity included in the same order controlled under the same ECCN does not exceed the amount specified in the LVS paragraph for that entry. Our amount was $3,000. So we want to look and see at group B, and Brazil is on there. So you can use LVS and write the ECCN is 1C006B2, and you put license exception LVS as you're exporting. If you're applying for a license, everything's filed electronically. You use SnapR, which is the same web interface that you use to apply for a commodity classification request. The applicant needs to be located in the US. It is almost always the US PPI or the US authorized agent of the foreign principal party in interest. Licenses can cover single shipments, or they can cover multiple shipments up to a certain value max. So you can apply for just one shipment if you're only going to do one export. But if you have a contract with a foreign customer and you know you're going to ship X amount over the year, you can apply for your license to cover the whole year or multiple years of value. Good resources are in the EAR. 748 and 750 give you information on what to include. 756 tells you how to appeal. 758 goes through clearance of exports, and 762 talks about your record keeping requirements. You're going to include names and addresses of all the parties to the transaction. So that will be the exporter, That would be the foreign buyer. If there's an intermediate consignee, the end user, and the relationship of all of those parties. You're going to give names, you're going to give addresses, you may give information on the finance party, all of the details that BIS would need. Then you include your product information. You would state the ECCN that you would either obtain from the manufacturer, gotten from a CJ or a CCATS. If you did that, you would provide the CCATS detail. You would include your self-classified ECCN if you did it that way. You'd put the quantity, the value, the manufacturer, any technical information, especially you want it included if the technical information impacts the ECCN and or the license requirement. You need to make sure that that's involved. You would upload support documents. So you may upload images of the items. You may include mill certificates or chemical lab certificates. Certain products or certain destinations require additional details. For example, chemicals and pharmaceuticals or nuclear non-proliferation items or robots or encryption classification, those require additional details, and the EAR spells out what specifically you need for those kinds of items. There's also certain destinations that need more paperwork. Hong Kong is one of those places that requires additional information. And you would include BIS 711, which is a statement by the end user that says, I'm going to abide by all the rules. I've been informed of the rules and I solemnly swear to uphold them. And you also provide your name and what you're going to use it for. The end user does. BIS publishes a lot of information that is written in layperson instead of in legalese. It is very accessible. It is much more accessible than most of what's published by customs for importers. I think just in large part because BIS is a relatively new agency, whereas we've had customs since the 17 and 1800s. So some of that language is less accessible. You can also ask BIS questions. I recommend if you're going to go to BIS, maybe check with an expert to make sure that your question won't inadvertently get you into trouble and reveal that you don't know what you're talking about. You want to review your exporting and your licenses regularly and be very proactive. Licenses can sometimes take a while to acquire, so can commodity classifications or the like. So those you want to get a move on before you're going to need them. These are some of the resources. There's the BIS website. It is fantastic. They also have many recorded trainings, and they have in-person and remote multi-day trainings to go through information. There are links to the Export Administration regulations directly to the Commerce Control List, to the Export Control Decision Tree, the country chart, and the country groups list. Remember, the country chart is what you cross-reference your ECCN with. Links on commodity jurisdiction and how to apply for a commodity jurisdiction, as well as SNAP-R. That is the website where you apply for both a commodity classification to BIS and for licenses. And then there are some videos on how to fill that out, which tend to be very helpful. Take the survey after the webinar. That's how you get the topics that you want to hear about it. And submit your CCS or CES credit requests to train@starusa.org. There are credits available. Thank you so much for joining us today. And if you would like, I'm going to turn off the recording and you can stick around to hear Michael ask me questions.